The elegant silver spoon dropped, not into the truffle soup, but onto the pristine white tablecloth, signifying the catastrophic end of Marcus Thorne's career. He thought his arrogance was untouchable, but he failed to read the cold steel in Vincent Moretti's eyes, the kind of stillness that preceded the avalanche. Haven't we all seen that person who believes they are irreplaceable, only to watch them learn a painful lesson about true worth? It's a moment of satisfying, yet terrifying, realization. If you want to dive deep into stories of impossible consequences and deserved justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel right now. It fuels every thrilling narrative we bring you. The ex-boyfriend's sneer was just the first misstep. The true consequence wouldn't be financial ruin, but the quiet, absolute disappearance of his entire future, orchestrated from the shadows of a Michelin-starred kitchen. The Air Inn. The Pantheon, Vincent Moretti's flagship New York restaurant, was a delicate composition of old money, French oak, and the faint, expensive scent of power. It was here, amidst the muted conversation of financiers and politicians, that the current tension, sharper than any chef's knife, found its origin. Vincent, or Vince as he preferred when handling sensitive matters, was not merely a restaurateur. He was the silent center of a sprawling operation, using high-end gastronomy as a flawless conduit for money movements and clandestine meetings. His influence stretched from the docks to the highest courtrooms, all masked by 5-star reviews and impeccable service. Vince sat at a corner booth, the low light catching the sharp, tailored lines of his suit. Across from him was Ilara Vance, her composure reflecting the deep, quiet strength he admired. She wasn't just a world-class sommelier. She was a woman who had pulled herself out of a painful past defined by the manipulative control of Marcus Thorne. Marcus had been a promising but deeply arrogant executive chef in a rival establishment, and his relationship with Ilara had been a cycle of belittlement and possessiveness. When Ilara finally broke free and found success and genuine respect under Vince's patronage, and eventually his heart, Marcus's ego shattered. It was this broken ego that led Marcus to the Pantheon. Tonight, uninvited, fueled by 3 glasses of expensive bitter wine, he approached their table with a practiced casual cruelty. Well, if it isn't Ilara, trading up for a fancier tie, I see," Marcus mocked, his voice just loud enough to cut through the ambient jazz. Ilara flinched, not from fear, but from the sudden sharp recollection of his toxicity. "You really think this suit can buy you happiness, Ilara? You'll never find someone with my passion, my culinary talent. You ran from real fire, Vance. You settled for a comfortable burner. The silence that followed was instant and absolute." Marcus only saw a man in an expensive suit. He failed to register the instantaneous shift in the atmosphere, the sudden stiffness of the nearby waiters, the subtle change in the light reflecting off Vince's eyes. Ilara, however, recognized the warning signs in the quiet way Vince set down his glass of aged Barolo. Vince leaned forward slightly, his expression utterly serene, yet profoundly dangerous. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I believe you have mistaken your worth, Mr. Thorne," Vince said, his tone chillingly polite. Ilara didn't settle. She found better. "Now I suggest you leave my establishment before you find out what happens to men who challenge my woman's heart." Marcus, high on perceived superiority, scoffed, trying to maintain his bravado. "Oh, is that a threat, Moretti? What are you going to do? Give me a bad review?" Vince didn't dignify the remark with a direct answer. Instead, he made a small, almost imperceptible gesture to a tall, silent man standing near the entrance who immediately disappeared into the kitchen. Vince then looked directly into Marcus's eyes, the promise of devastation clear in the depths of his gaze. "Your game, Mr. Thorne, is already over." Marcus Thorne left. The Pantheon, feeling the chill of the New York night, but dismissing the incident as the bluster of a rich, possessive man. He had made his point. He had seen Ilara flinch. That momentary victory was enough to soothe his bruised ego. He couldn't possibly imagine the gears already turning, initiated by Vince's subtle nod. The first sign that something was deeply wrong wasn't a sudden threat, but a creeping, suffocating silence. Marcus worked at Ether, a competitor high-end restaurant where he was head executive chef. The following morning, the usual buzz of delivery trucks and supplier calls vanished. The deliveries were late, then canceled entirely. The fresh fish order, critical for the night's service, didn't arrive. When his sous chef called the supplier, they received a polite but firm explanation. An unexpected massive shift in inventory priorities meant Ether was temporarily deprioritized. It felt like a logistical glitch, but Marcus sensed the unnatural quietness of the walk-in refrigerator, the absence of activity that usually defined his mornings. Later that afternoon, a key pastry chef abruptly resigned, citing unforeseen family circumstances and giving zero notice. This was the individual Marcus had secretly entrusted with his most delicate new menu item. The disruption was immediate and severe. He tried to contact his main ingredient distributors, the people he had worked with for years, only to find their phones diverted or their accounts suddenly restricted. Ilara, meanwhile, was oblivious to the immediate mechanisms of Marcus's downfall, but she observed the change in Vince. He was even more focused, less overtly affectionate, though his attention remained intense. He spoke in low tones on the phone, often using coded language about rerouting inventory and adjusting stakeholder portfolios. She knew intrinsically that Marcus was being dealt with, but Vince shielded her from the brutal reality of his methods. He had made a silent promise to protect her peace, and he was honoring it with surgical precision. One evening, while reviewing wine lists in Vince's dimly lit private study, Ilara found a discarded, half-shredded document concerning the zoning permits for a multi-million-dollar construction project in the city's meat-packing district. A project Marcus had frequently boasted about bidding on, hoping to open his own solo venue. The document, clearly labeled Thorne Block, was stamped with an alarming bold "Denied." Ilara felt a chill. Marcus wasn't just being inconvenienced. His future, the very foundation of his ambition, was being quietly disassembled. She connected the dots. Vince wasn't merely blocking him from his current job. He was ensuring that Marcus would never rise again in New York's cutthroat culinary scene. The silence wasn't random, it was orchestrated. It smelled like the quiet decay of buried concrete, a promise made good in the most devastating way possible. The initial logistical glitches quickly escalated into professional paralysis for Marcus. He was used to the rhythmic pressure of a busy kitchen, the organized chaos that defined elite dining. Now, the silence was deafening, the lack of crucial supplies crippling. The head chef at Ether, Marcus's direct superior, finally called him into the office, his face a roadmap of stress and confusion. "Marcus, we are hemorrhaging money. The health department found 3 minor infractions this morning that have escalated into a full temporary closure order," his superior stated, running a hand through his hair. "It's unheard of. We pass checks weekly." Marcus recognized the pattern of sabotage. This wasn't bad luck. This was organized. His mind raced back to Vince Moretti, the quiet threat in the pantheon. But how could a single restaurateur wield such absolute targeted power? He tried to argue, to call the councilman he knew, the inspector he had routinely tipped, but every door slammed shut with unnerving speed and finality. The sound of the lock clicking on Ether's front door felt like a physical blow, a solid confirmation that his domain was dissolving. Meanwhile, Ilara wrestled with the morality of the situation. She appreciated the absolute protection Vince offered. It was a stark contrast to Marcus's emotional manipulation. But watching the deliberate dismantling of a man's life, even a cruel man, felt heavy. She brought it up carefully one night as they were overlooking the shimmering lights of the city from Vince's penthouse balcony. "Vince, is it necessary to destroy him entirely? He's lost his job, his new project." Vince turned, his reflection in the glass a somber outline against the city's electric pulse. "Ilara, you still view him as a pathetic chef. I see him as a persistent threat to your peace, a threat to my interests. When a cancer is removed, you ensure every cell is gone, or it returns stronger." He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He challenged the structure I built for you. He mocked your choice, questioning my ability to provide what he never could, genuine security and respect. That is an insult I cannot allow to stand, not because of ego, but because allowing him to survive and rebuild means he will try to hurt you, again to reclaim what he lost." His logic was cold, corporate, and terrifyingly efficient. Ilara understood then that Vince's love wasn't a soft embrace. It was a fortress. She saw the profound difference between Marcus's cheap sneer of, "You'll never find someone like me," and Vince's grim resolve to make Marcus irrelevant. The complication wasn't external now, it was internal. Ilara realized she was linked not just to a wealthy man, but to a force that operated outside the law, a force that considered social annihilation a mild form of self-defense. The sound of the heavy insulated door of the penthouse closing behind her felt like the final click into place of a very expensive, very protective trap. Marcus, now desperate, realized he had lost his professional network, his restaurant base, and his future solo project. He resorted to the only thing he felt he had left: public reputation. He began an intense social media campaign, framing the shutdowns and denials as a conspiracy orchestrated by a jealous competitor, naming Vince Moretti indirectly as a man who confuses ownership with protection. He was trying to poison the well, hoping public scrutiny would force Vince to retract his hand. The response was swift, overwhelming, and entirely unexpected. Instead of sympathy, Marcus faced a torrent of targeted, highly specific attacks. Suddenly, anonymous sources were leaking details of his previous, barely legal kitchen hygiene practices, old whispers of emotional abuse directed at junior staff, and documented cases of fraudulent expense reports from 5 years prior, all presented with irrefutable proof. The details were so granular, so deeply buried, that Marcus knew this went beyond mere digital sleuthing. This was an excavation performed by professional, relentless operatives. His reputation, the only currency he had left, dissolved into toxic fumes online. He felt the cold touch of absolute vulnerability. His losses weren't confined to the digital sphere. He found his apartment lease abruptly terminated due to a technicality regarding undocumented pet occupancy, a goldfish he'd had for 3 years. His credit rating, previously impeccable, now showed a series of frozen accounts and unexplained audits, rendering him unable to secure new financing or even rent a new place easily. The cumulative effect was the dismantling of his very ability to exist in the city he cherished. Marcus felt the panic rising, a sour taste in his mouth that no wine could wash away. He was losing control, not just of his career, but of his life's physical structures. He realized the scale of the error he had made by mocking Alara and challenging Vince. This wasn't professional rivalry. It was a scorched earth campaign. As the situation intensified, we're racing toward a major turning point in this story. We are so close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you who hits that subscribe button right now helps make the next chapter even bigger. Support the channel, and let us know if you want more stories about power plays and impossible consequences. Marcus finally made the call he dreaded most. To an old associate, a fixer named Sal, who operated strictly outside the law. Sal listened to Marcus's frantic, disjointed tale of woe. "Moretti, you say? The restaurant guy?" Sal's voice was low and cautious. "Marcus, you didn't challenge a rival chef. You challenged the heart of the city's structure. You need to understand. When a man like Vince Moretti says he'll bury you, he means he'll erase the map you were standing on. You can't fight him with bad Yelp reviews. Your mistake was touching his woman. That's where the secret power ends your entire game." The stark reality of Sal's statement hung heavy, an undeniable weight of peril pressing down on Marcus. He had officially run out of legal options, and now he had to consider the impossible. The point of maximum despair arrived when Marcus found himself sleeping in a borrowed, dusty storage unit. The smell of concrete and old cardboard was a sharp, mocking contrast to the refined scent of his former life. He had spent his last savings trying to hire a lawyer, who quit after one phone call, citing an inexplicable conflict of interest that reeked of external pressure. Marcus was completely isolated, the world he knew having smoothly closed ranks against him. It was then, in the suffocating darkness of his temporary exile, that he received the summons. Not an official court document, but a simple, elegantly engraved card delivered by a silent, serious man. The card invited him to meet Vincent Moretti at a precise location, a secluded private dining room within the Pantheon, at midnight. Marcus knew this was not an invitation to reconciliation. It was an ultimatum, the final reckoning. He had two choices: flee the city immediately and forever, or face the architect of his ruin. His arrogance, though severely dented, compelled him toward confrontation. He needed to look the man who had destroyed him in the eye. He arrived promptly at midnight. The Pantheon was dark, save for the soft golden light spilling from the private room near the kitchen, an area reserved for Vince's most sensitive operations. The room smelled of polished mahogany and the faint residual warmth of a recent meal, perhaps a single malt scotch. Vince was alone, seated at a long table reviewing paperwork, his composure absolute. "Thank you for joining me, Mr. Thorne," Vince said, gesturing to the seat opposite him. "I prefer to finalize business face to face." Marcus, gaunt and visibly exhausted, leaned forward. "You've ruined me." "Why? Was it worth all this trouble just because I made a comment about Alara?" Vince sighed, a gesture of genuine fatigue at having to explain the obvious to a lesser mind. "Your comments were irrelevant. Your intentions were the problem. You sneered, 'She'll never find someone like me.' You insulted her discernment and her strength. You suggested that my relationship with her was merely a temporary diversion from your real fire. I'm many things, Marcus, but I am not temporary, and I certainly do not allow small men to challenge the heart of my foundation." Vince paused, his gaze hardening into something granite-like. I told you she found better. Now, the final consequence. Leave New York tonight. Forget Ilara's name. Forget the city. Disappear entirely, and the audits stop. Stay, and I proceed with the evidence that shows you've been laundering funds for a rival organization for the past 3 years. Choose. The choice wasn't between fighting and fleeing. It was between immediate, total erasure, or the certainty of a downfall so severe it would involve prison and public humiliation. Vince had not just taken his future. He had meticulously prepared a past that would legally destroy him. Marcus looked at the man across the table, not a chef, but a power broker, a silent king. He felt a profound, chilling respect for the scope of the secret power that had ended his entire game. The air was thick with the weight of the impossible decision. Marcus chose immediate flight. The thought of a long, humiliating trial based on manufactured yet highly persuasive evidence was intolerable. The sting wasn't just the loss of his career. It was the realization that Vince had anticipated his every move, outmaneuvered him on every legal and social front, and had cornered him without ever raising his voice or dirtying his own hands. The confrontation had been the climax of the title's promise, Marcus sneering, Vince confirming his power, and the consequence becoming inevitable. He left. The Pantheon feeling like a ghost already, slipping into the dark street with only a small duffel bag containing essentials. He was leaving not just a city, but an identity. Marcus's compliance, however, did not grant him immediate peace. Vince had demanded he disappear, and to ensure that disappearance was permanent and untraceable, a final, necessary cruelty was enacted. Marcus had one last refuge, a safety deposit box containing old photographs, jewelry meant for Ilara, and a single ledger detailing some minor but sensitive financial transactions he had conducted years ago. He had planned to sell the jewelry to fund his escape. He found the bank lobby strangely silent. When he requested access to his box, the attendant smiled politely and returned with an official sealed envelope. Inside, a simple note. Account closed, contents reallocated. There was no explanation, no legal recourse mentioned, just the absolute removal of his last physical ties to his past. The ledger, in particular, was the key. Now it was in Vince's hands, a fail-safe, ensuring Marcus could never use that information for retaliation. Vince knew that true control meant not only silencing the enemy, but removing all of his potential weapons. Ilara was unaware of the details of the midnight meeting, but she felt the quiet shift in Vince's demeanor. He was relaxed again, the taut tension around his eyes easing. When she asked if the situation with Marcus was resolved, he simply said, "He has chosen to focus on endeavors that are more geographically isolated, Ilara. His capacity to disturb your tranquility is 0. The realization of the depth of Vince's control was a heavy silk shawl draped over Ilara's shoulders, warm, luxurious, and binding. She saw the true nature of his protection during a dinner at their apartment when Vince received a call. It was a brief, coded exchange regarding the rezoning of Sector 4. Vince listened, nodded, and concluded the call. He then smiled at Ilara, completely switching registers. "More wine, my love. The Chateau Aubryon is breathing beautifully tonight." The speed with which he transitioned from ruthlessly managing his underworld to domestic elegance was stunning. It solidified for Ilara that she was with a man who controlled not just restaurants, but the very infrastructure of power. She was safe, yes, but she was also protected by a man who could erase people without a second thought. The betrayal was complete. Marcus's legacy was now buried beneath the concrete of New York City, and Ilara found herself standing atop that burial site, protected by the man who held the shovel. The profound internal conflict about her protector's methods was the next hurdle she had to face. The total annihilation of Marcus Thorne's life had achieved its intended effect. Ilara's external threat was gone. However, it replaced external fear with internal disquiet. She had loved Vince for his strength, his dedication, and his protection, but the efficiency of his secret power was too immense to ignore. She realized she was deeply involved with a man capable of judicial and social murder, all under the guise of corporate restructuring. Ilara felt the need to understand the true nature of Vince's empire, not to betray him, but to justify her commitment to a man who lived in the ethical gray zone. She began a subtle, calculated exploration. Her background as a sommelier required acute sensory focus and precise memory, skills she now applied to her environment. She wasn't looking for proof of wrongdoing, but for the map of his influence. She focused on Vince's weekly meetings. She noticed that the private dining room, where Marcus had received his ultimatum, often hosted politicians, judges, and developers, people far removed from the restaurant industry. She started linking the seemingly innocuous names on their guest lists to local headlines about zoning approvals and city contracts. One afternoon, while Vince was at a lengthy golf course business meeting, Ilara accessed his secure home office. She bypassed the biometric security with a technique she had observed Vince using countless times, a specific, confident placement of his thumb on the scanner, held for exactly 3 seconds. The office smelled overwhelmingly of expensive leather and printing ink. Her deadline was the moment Vince's driver texted the 5-minute arrival code. So she worked with focused urgency. She located a safe disguised behind a wall-length wine rack. Inside, she found not money, but evidence, a series of encrypted hard drives and a physical ledger bound in black Italian leather. The ledger, titled simply The Accounts, contained a detailed handwritten log of illicit transactions, political favors, and names that formed a complete flowchart of the city's underbelly, all connected through the Pantheon's operational budgets. Ilara meticulously photographed the most crucial pages using a high-resolution camera on her phone, storing the images in a heavily encrypted, cloud-based folder that only she could access. She felt a profound, chilling surge of adrenaline. She hadn't found proof of generic corruption. She had found the organizational spine of Vince Moretti's power, the very secret power that allowed him to bury men like Marcus Thorne without blinking. She replaced everything exactly as she found it. This process of quiet investigation and self-preservation was draining, but we appreciate you sticking with the story to this point. Since all our content is free, we rely entirely on your support. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. We are working hard to hit 1,000 subscribers, and every click helps us bring you more high-quality, intense narratives like this one. Thank you for your support. Ilara now held the key to Vince's entire kingdom. Her preparation was complete. She had armed herself with knowledge, understanding that if she was to remain by Vince's side, she had to fully comprehend the cost of his protection and have the leverage to ensure her own security should his gaze ever turn cold toward her. The crisis didn't arrive with a bang, but with a subtle, unnerving hum. Vince and Ilara were hosting a charity gala at one of his newer venues, a glass-encased space overlooking the Hudson River. The atmosphere was refined, dominated by the clinking of champagne flutes and the rustle of designer silk. Ilara, radiant and composed, moved through the crowd, playing her role as the powerful partner to perfection, the encrypted evidence heavy in her mental safe. Suddenly a disturbance rippled through the polished facade of the event. A high-ranking city official, an important contact of Vince's named Senator Davies, was escorted out abruptly by two grim-faced men in dark suits. Moments later, the music cut out. The house lights flickered, plunging the hall into a momentary shocking darkness before the emergency lighting activated, bathing the room in an oppressive amber glow. The sudden unnatural quiet was instantly oppressive. Vince received a hushed phone call. His face, usually a mask of control, tightened. He signaled to his head of security, a man named Angelo, who immediately began steering key figures towards the secondary exits. "Internal pressure," Vince murmured to Ilara, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "It seems a few rats decided to sing before I could muzzle them." Ilara's mind immediately focused on the ledger she had photographed. The scale of the chaos suggested that a massive internal leak, perhaps a double cross from a longtime associate, was collapsing Vince's intricate silent system. The organization, designed to operate in the shadows, was now exposed to the blinding light of public and judicial scrutiny. The foundation of his secret power was under attack. Just as Vince was guiding Ilara toward a discreet emergency exit, Angelo rushed back, his composure rattled. "Boss, the precinct is sealed. They're not looking for evidence, they're looking for you." Davies flipped and gave them everything on the port dealings. The smell of stale river air rushed in as Vince pulled open the exit door, the sounds of distant sirens growing rapidly louder. He was no longer the composed host. He was a king scrambling from a sudden palace invasion. Ilara felt a paradoxical calm. This was the true test of Vince's character, stripped of the glamour. He looked at her, his eyes intense. "Ilara, we need to move fast. If they catch me, the exposure will be catastrophic." The pressure was palpable, forcing a decision. Ilara realized that if she left with Vince, she would become a fugitive, completely reliant on his rapidly diminishing protection. If she stayed, she might be viewed as an accomplice. The crisis had arrived, forcing her to consider activating her own contingency plan. The highly encrypted photographs of the accounts that proved Vince's power, but also her knowledge of it. Vince and Ilara managed to slip out of the venue and into the frantic night, narrowly avoiding the tightening cordon of federal agents. They found temporary refuge in a safe house, a minimalist, soundproof apartment in an industrial sector, smelling faintly of stale cigar smoke and concrete dust. The environment was the opposite of their usual penthouse luxury, reflecting the sudden collapse of Vince's empire. This was Ilara's dark night of the soul. She sat by a window, watching the silent, massive cranes move against the gray sky, representing the very projects Vince had controlled. She finally confronted the raw reality of her choice. She had been insulted by a small, cruel man, Marcus, and protected by a powerful, ruthless one, Vince. Marcus had been emotionally abusive. Vince had been physically protective, yet morally compromising. The conflict was agonizing. Vince offered absolute loyalty and security, yet demanded silence and complicity with his shadow world. He had eliminated Marcus because he saw him as an inconvenience to her well-being, but his methods were absolute. Ilara realized she had traded one form of manipulation for a vastly more potent, institutionalized version. Vince, meanwhile, was in the other room, working the phones, his frustration radiating like heat from a furnace. He was losing grip, betrayed by his own system. His voice was sharp, giving orders that were increasingly met with resistance. He wasn't the invincible figure she had met. He was a man cornered, fighting for his survival. Ilara knew she couldn't simply walk away. She had seen too much. Vince would never allow her to leave with the knowledge she possessed, knowledge now magnified by the evidence she had secretly acquired. Her silence was his safety. Her departure would be seen as betrayal. If she fled, she risked facing the same complete annihilation that Marcus had suffered, only this time directed at her. She had to redefine her purpose. Her original goal was peace, achieved through Vince's protection. Now her goal was true independence and safety, which meant securing her own future outside of Vince's influence, but without becoming his next casualty. The encrypted folder on her phone wasn't just proof. It was leverage. It was the shield that would allow her to survive the coming storm, the ultimate insurance policy against the man who had proven he could bury anyone who crossed him. Ilara looked at the contact information she had secretly obtained for a federal agent involved in the recent arrests, a name from the accounts ledger, and knew she had to step onto the moral high ground, even if it meant betraying the man who saved her heart. The silence in the safe house was broken by the grating sound of a radio transmission coming from Vince's corner. He slammed the device down, his jaw tight. They got Davies in custody, and now the federal task force is closing in on the properties. They know about the New Jersey shipment routes. I need to move now, Ilara. We cross the border tonight. Vince approached her, his eyes searching hers for loyalty, for the reassurance he was used to. "Are you with me?" he asked, his voice a low command. Ilara met his gaze, the quiet strength she had reclaimed during her time of reflection radiating from her. "Yes, Vince, I am with you." It was a lie, but a necessary one to ensure her survival. She knew the precise moment she needed to act. She waited until Vince was focused on packing a small, heavily fortified travel safe. She walked into the tiny, sterile kitchen, grabbed a bottle of imported mineral water, and returned, handing it to Vince. "You need to stay hydrated," she said softly. As he took a long drink, Ilara's fingers rapidly typed a code into her phone. It was the activation code for her encrypted folder. She initiated the transmission of all the photographic evidence of the accounts ledger to the contact she had chosen. Agent Ramirez, the federal operative mentioned in the ledger. "I needed you to feel safe," Vince said, watching her with a weary expression. "That's why I eliminated Thorne. He was poison. I built a fortress for us. And the fortress is falling, Vince," Ilara countered, her voice steady. "I was safe from Marcus, yes, but I was never safe from this." She gestured around the cramped safe house, a symbol of their sudden descent. "I can't live beneath the crushing weight of your structure anymore. I found better than Marcus, but I need better than the man who buries men like him." Vince frowned, sensing a change in her tone, the shift from supportive partner to judge. He began to question her, but before he could voice his suspicion, the external noise began. Not the distant, polite sirens of the other night, but the harsh, demanding roar of a massive convoy of vehicles surrounding the building. The sound was an earthquake of law enforcement, accompanied by the blinding white glare of floodlights. Vince's eyes widened in stunned recognition. How did they find this place so fast? Only 3 people knew this address. His gaze snapped to Ilara, his expression morphing from confusion to absolute, devastating realization. "You," he whispered, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "You found your own way out?" He lunged for the phone on the table, desperate to call his last remaining fixers, but Alara was quicker. She stepped back, her stance defensive, and held up her own phone, showing him the "upload complete" notification. She had sacrificed the security of his love for the certainty of her own freedom. The heavy door to the safe house splintered under the impact of the federal raid team. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and dust as the federal agents breached the safe house door. The rapid controlled movements of the task force contrasted sharply with Vince's sudden, helpless stillness. He stood frozen, his empire collapsing around him, betrayed by the very woman he had protected with absolute ruthlessness. The realization of Ilara's competence and calculated independence was a sharper blow than any physical confrontation. Agent Ramirez, a woman whose name Ilara now knew was tied to a previous, stalled investigation into Vince's network, entered first, her eyes scanning the room. She spotted Ilara immediately, then focused on Vince, who was trapped between the shattered doorframe and the furniture. "Vincent Moretti, you are under arrest," Ramirez announced, the authority in her voice cutting through the remaining tension. Vince didn't resist. He merely stared at Ilara, his composure finally breaking into a look of profound, cold disappointment. "You gave them the accounts," he stated, his voice barely audible over the agent's movements. He didn't ask. He knew. "After everything I did to protect you, you dismantled me." "You only protected your control over me, Vince," Ilara replied, stepping away from him, toward Agent Ramirez. "You buried Marcus because he challenged your ownership. You would have buried me too if I ever truly stepped out of your perfect picture. The difference between you and Marcus was merely the scale of the prison you offered." The justice was not loud or explosive. It was methodical and final. Ramirez approached Ilara, recognizing the woman who had delivered the definitive proof they needed. "Ms. Vance, we need you to come with us. You are considered a key witness." As Vince was led away, the sound of the handcuffs clicking was the ultimate payoff to the promise made in the Pantheon. The impossible consequence had arrived, but for the wrong person, or perhaps the truly deserving one. His entire game was over, not by the hands of his rivals, but by the woman whose heart he thought he owned. The biggest twist, however, was for Marcus Thorne. Weeks later, hiding in a desolate, forgotten town hundreds of miles away, he saw a grainy online photo of Vincent Moretti being escorted into a federal building, the headlines screaming of corruption and racketeering. The realization hit him. The man who had promised to bury him was now buried himself. Marcus's ruin had inadvertently triggered the collapse of the stronger man. Ilara hadn't just moved on. She had found the capacity to destroy the man who mocked her choice by surviving his protection and turning his own power against him. 6 months later, the opulent echo of Vince Moretti's empire had faded, replaced by the diligent sounds of legal restructuring and federal seizure. The Pantheon was closed, its pristine white tablecloths covered in protective plastic, the quiet scent of dust replacing the expensive aroma of fine dining. Ilara Vance was living in a different city now, under a modified form of witness protection, not from Vince, who was preoccupied with the vast legal battle he faced, but from the remaining factions of his organization. Her life was quieter, simpler, and profoundly honest. She chose a profession that was entirely independent and focused on genuine craftsmanship. She opened a small, highly specialized wine boutique, Vitis, focused on sustainable vineyards and emerging global regions. Her new store was the antithesis of The Pantheon's grandiose ambition. The walls were painted in soothing shades of earth tones, and the only sound was the gentle clink of bottles being handled with care. The air smelled purely of grapes, cork, and clean glass, no lingering scent of illicit power or corporate maneuvering. Ilara still carried the weight of her time with Vince, the understanding of how easily power corrupts, and how quickly security can turn into a cage. But she had emerged not broken, but refined. She had faced two manipulative men, Marcus, who tried to undermine her self-worth, and Vince, who tried to command her loyalty through protection, and had defeated both by asserting her autonomy. She knew Marcus was still out there somewhere, a shadow of his former self, forced to live up to Vince's threat of burial, though, ironically, Vince was the one serving time. The knowledge that she was the quiet catalyst for the downfall of two powerful egos was her true security. She hadn't sought revenge, she had sought peace, and she found it only through true self-reliance. One afternoon, a package arrived at Vitis. It was a heavy sealed box containing all the personal items Vince had stored for her. Old letters, a few pieces of jewelry, and a single crisp photograph of them together at the opening night of the Pantheon. Attached was a note, delivered anonymously through a secure channel established by his legal team. It was short, written in Vince's elegant, confident hand. "You were right. I confused ownership with love. You taught me the difference between a cage and a home. Find your peace, Ilara." She carefully folded the note, placing it not in a drawer, but in the small incinerator behind the store. She didn't need his final approval or apology. Her peace was already found. Ilara stood in her small, honest boutique, surrounded by the simple elegance of her independent life, knowing that she had successfully navigated the impossible consequence and finally chosen herself.